Everybody, my name is Chris Pies, and welcome to another exciting classroom for season 12, if you can believe it, of PCA Sim Racing. This week marks the first classroom of the series, and it will be with the new Series 12 car, which is the 992 Cup, as you can see here, at Barber Motorsports Park in Birmingham, Alabama. With a new season, there's many people that may be watching this that have been classified new within PCA, so be sure to check to ensure that you are registering for the proper class. Your class that you may have been in for season 11 or earlier may have changed based on reclassification. Hopefully you're aware of that. If you have any questions whatsoever, reach out to anybody in Discord that has a mod or admin status and ask, what class am I in? And we'll be happy to tell you as soon as we take a look at it. But without further ado, we're going to launch right into this classroom and talk about both Barber, and because it is the first classroom for season 12, we're also going to talk about the 911 Cup car that we're using, which is vastly different than the GT3R that we used in previous seasons. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the 911 Cup, since it is a new car for us. If you've driven it, most of you probably know already, it differs quite substantially from the GT3R. The 911 Cup is a platform that Porsche uses for its junior drivers, and then also for kind of spec racing throughout the world. Porsche uses this car to train its junior drivers because it doesn't have driver aids. Like in this particular model that we're driving does not have traction control, and it does not have anti-lock brakes, ABS. What it does have is a ton of horsepower and a willingness to try to both go into snap oversteer and also a lot of understeer. These aspects of this car, the characteristics of this car, need to be driven in this car needs to be driven in a specific way to get the most out of it. If you try to drive it like a GT3 car, you're going to probably have a rough time. It's very easy to get discouraged with the way this car can handle, especially if you don't have a lot of time behind the wheel. And it's very easy to just blame this car as it's a mess and I can't drive it. The people that are going to succeed are the ones that have open minds and can adapt to the platform that we're all racing. If you are in challenge and sport classes, you will be running a fixed setup for this series and this car, so you can't change anything. The benefit of that is everybody's running the exact same setup. So if it understeers a lot, everybody's dealing with that understeer. If it oversteers, everybody's dealing with that oversteer. So the driver that can make the adjustments in their driving style to adapt to the way the car handles will be the ones that succeed. For Club and Pro, it is open setup, but there's not a whole lot you can do with this car in terms of setup to get it to behave kind of how you want it to. Changes are minimal. You can change the rake, you can change the wing, and you can change the toe, and that's about it, or in the ARBs, and that's about it. There's no shock changes. There's no front aero changes. It is very limited, and that's by design on this platform. So how do you drive the 911 Cup as opposed to other cars? Well, think about the platform of this car. All of the weight, or the majority of the weight, is back behind the driver. The engine sits behind the rear wheels, behind the rear axle, basically all the way in the rear bumper. That means that your mass, or the area of the car that is trying to move around, is this big block of flat six way in the back of the car, meaning that the car has a tendency to try to pendulum on you. It is difficult to try to change directions with the rear of the car, because not if the car is in the middle of a full G turn and then you try to go the other way, it's got to move that mass all the way from one side to the other. And if you try to do it too quickly, that can get out of hand very, very easily. The second thing that this car does is, because it has all the weight in the rear, it has very little weight up front. Very little weight up front means that there's very little weight on the front tires, the tires that steer. So we have to manage this in terms of balance when we're driving the car around the track. The other thing to make note of is this particular car has the fuel tank up in the frunk of the car, just like all 911s. So as you go through a race like the races in season 12, which are an hour long, and the fuel starts to burn off, you're going to lose weight in the front of the car, meaning that the car is going to start to feel like it's understeering more and more throughout a stint. So let's talk about what that means. Well, if the weight is in the rear of the car and there's no weight in the front of the car, what does that do for handling characteristics? Well, if my hand is the car and this is the rear and this is the front, whichever section of the car has more weight on it, it's pushing that rubber into the ground. Think of a tire as a pancake or a stress ball, and you smush it into a desk or you smush it into the ground. That stress ball is going to kind of start to pancake out in contact with the surface that you're pressing it against. The firmer or the more weight you put on it, the more it pancakes out, and the more grip or the more friction that stress ball or tire in this scenario has. So statically, when the car is not moving, the Porsche has more grip, relative grip in the rear of the car, because that's where all the weight sits, because of that engine and the way it's set up. It also has a staggered setup, meaning the rear tires are larger than the front tires. So there's more actual physical rubber touching the road, even if the weight was equal. So there's more inherent grip in the rear of the car. The front of the car, because it's lighter, has less weight on those front tires, which means they have less grip. The tires are also thinner, so they just don't have as much surface space in contact with the road. So what you end up having is a car that has a tendency to understeer, especially when you start going into a corner. So you start turning into a corner, the front end doesn't feel as sharp as some other cars, especially different class cars like GT3s and especially things like prototypes. What it does have, though, is after you've made your initial turn into the car, when you go back and transition to throttle and accelerate out of a corner, it has a lot of grip in the rear tires in the rear, meaning you can transition to power really early or earlier than you would expect, because those rear tires are going to just smush into the rear of the ground, and it's going to allow you to accelerate, take that grip. So when you drive this car around a track like Barber or any track, you need to play to this car's strengths and kind of minimize its weaknesses. I would classify the weaknesses of the Cup car are poor initial turn in into a corner, and then maybe about mid-corner, there's a tendency for, if you get on the throttle too soon, the front end to understeer because you're taking the weight off the front tires. Where its strengths lie is coming out of the corner, so accelerating out of a corner and getting really good grip on the way out. The people that tend to be very fast in the Cup are really good on the brakes, which, remember, no anti-lock brakes, so it's all about modulation and how close to that edge of grip can you get before lockup to maximize your ability to brake, but also that ability to get the car rotated mid-corner, get it pointed in the right direction, and transition to power coming out of the corner. So for me, when I drive this car, my mentality or what I'm thinking of is get the car rotated early in the corner. So basically get the turning done earlier in the corner and get to a point where I can get on throttle and accelerate coming out of a corner as early as possible. Is there any questions about the car itself, handling dynamics, or anything like that? Nobody? Okay.
You'll touch on trail braking at some point here, won't you?
Yeah, so that was the next thing I was going to say. But in terms of the platform, sounds like everybody knows. But how do you kind of overcome that lack of grip up front and that excess grip in the rear? Well, we manipulate the weight balance of the car in order to do that. How do we do that? Well, we use the pedals to move the weight around. If you're braking, the platform of whatever race car you're using, the weight shift is going to shift to the front of the car. Well, that's good because as we're braking, we want the front tires are going to do the majority of the work, and we want more weight on the front tires to help us grip. Well, we brake, we get more grip on the front. When we accelerate, the opposite is going to happen, and the weight is going to transition to the rear of the car. Well, that's great because as we accelerate, the rear tires are going to be doing most of the work, and more weight on the rear of the car is going to allow them to have more grip to accept that acceleration. So if the car tends to understeer because there's lack of weight up front, what can we do as drivers to get the front tires to have more grip? Well, we can brake and transition the weight or move the balance of the car and the weight of the car to the front tires. That's what's trail braking, and the Cup car really likes to trail brake. So going into a corner like turn 1 at Barber, let's say when you hit the brakes, you're going to move the weight to the front of the car. the front tires are going to have more grip than they otherwise would if you weren't braking. And then when you start transitioning and you start steering into the corner, if you stay on the brakes a little bit and kind of keep a little bit of pressure on that brakes and slowly bleed off it as you turn in, you're keeping the weight in the platform of the car like this, with the front end of the car is going to have more grip because of the braking. That's going to allow the car to want to turn in because you have grip up front. If you overdo it though, and you basically stay in the car on its nose and then try to turn it, one or two things are going to happen. One, if you do it too severely, the front tires are going to run out of grip and they can't turn and brake at the same time really well. And so if you're asking more than what the tire can give you, they're going to lock up, and that's when you're going to get tire lock going into a corner. The other scenario that can potentially happen based on the corner is if you do that too much, you're standing the car on its nose, you're taking the weight off the rear tires. Once you turn in, the front end grips, the rear doesn't have a lot of traction because there's no weight on the rear tires, or relatively little weight, and the rear is going to rotate on entry. If you're not ready for it, that can catch you out, and the rear can over-rotate, and you can swap ends and spin on the entry into a corner. The really good drivers are going to be the ones that can manage that balance, this delicate balance, to where when you brake and turn in and trail brake into the front end of the corner, you're allowing the front tires to have grip, you're taking a little bit of grip on the rear, and you're getting that rotation on entry into the corner, catching that rotation as it goes through the entry of the corner, getting it pointed. That's what I mean by rotating in the beginning of the corner, getting it pointed early, and then accelerating out. So to drive the Cup fast, you have to get comfortable with the car, the rear of the car wanting to start to rotate relatively early, balancing that with not having too much. You don't want to slide the rear, but you want to have what's called slip angle, have a little bit of rotation in the car, a little bit of yaw. I think it's something like 8 to 10% yaw going through the corner, or the beginning of the corner, to get the car to rotate. And then once it starts to rotate, you get off the brakes, so you move the weight transfer back to a neutral spot, start accelerating, which means you start pushing those rear tires back into the ground, taking the grip from the front, and you transition from that like rotating state in the beginning to a more stable understeery state coming out. That's all it is. It's very difficult to get. It's a very, very delicate balance, and because there's no traction control in this car, if you get in a spot where you've over rotated the car, it's very difficult to recover it if you're not ready for it. So like all race cars, sliding is bad. Doing formula drifts around corners is slow. It overheats your tires and it's just not fast. But there is a spot in there where you get a little bit of rotation, a little bit of tiny bit of drift, and it allows you to get that rotation done early to get your car in a good spot to accelerate out of the corners. Remember, with this car, it's all about accelerating out of corners and getting a good run, getting to power early. Doing whatever you can to get the car into a state to allow you to get to throttle earlier than your competitors tends to lead to you accelerating out of corners faster.
Chris, question.
Yes, sir. Yeah. No?
On this car.
I'll say it one more time. I lost you. I didn't catch what you said.
Oh, sorry. So how effective is lifting the throttle in moving the balance to the front of the car in this car?
I mean, it's better than nothing. Let's put it that way. So, it's when we talk about weight dynamics and weight transfer, it's all relative to the situation or where the car was before you performed an action that will result in weight transfer. So if you're under full acceleration, your car is probably going to be a little bit of bias. You're going to be pulling a little bit of G's to the rear, not very much. As soon as you let off that throttle, your car is going to relatively snap back to where more of a neutral state. So you're basically from where the accelerating port was, where you lift off the throttle, you're going to put the car in a more neutral state, which means the front tires will have more grip than they did when you were full on accelerating. So you're relatively adding grip to the front and removing it from the rear as soon as you let off the gas. Add a little brake, and now the car is going to pitch forward, and it's going to add even more weight to the front tires, which is going to give you more grip up front. So by just lifting or even cracking the throttle is going to add grip to the front tires relative to they were before you did that action. So think of it that way. Don't think of it as, oh, if I don't do anything, I'm just in a neutral state, which means I have a ton of understeer. Well, yeah, but you have less understeer than if you were still accelerating.
Yeah, my question was more about relative to the GT3R. Is it more effective, less effective to lift throttle?
Oh, it's going to be less effective. This car is going to hold its speed more than the GT3R. Because you got to remember, the GT3R, not only does it have a big wing on the rear of it, it also has a huge front splitter and front aerodynamics. This car, relatively, in the front is a bar of soap. There's no grip. We have a little splitter, and it's tiny. It's like that big. So it's pushing less. The air or it doesn't have as much drag as a GT3R, is what I'm trying to say. So if you lift off the throttle, yeah, you're going to slow down. Every car will slow down because of the aerodynamic resistance. But this doesn't have as much aerodynamic resistance as a GT3R. And that's one of the reasons why it has understeer, is because there's just no grip on the front tires because of it. A GT3R has got a big splitter and front aerodynamics that help push the front end of the car into the ground, even while accelerating. So when you lift off the throttle in a GT3R, all that wind resistance is it's like a parachute coming out the back. This thing is not nearly as much like that. Great question. One more thing I'll say before we get into the track walk about the handling characteristics of this car, and this goes for everybody, even if you're on a fixed setup, is brake bias. Your brake bias can change the dynamics of how this car handles significantly, even if you're on a fixed setup. And even if you're on a fixed setup, you can adjust your brake bias. Moving your brake bias to the rear of the car is going to give you a sense of more rotation on entry into a corner. If you move the brake bias forward, it's going to give you less rotation on entry into the corner. So think of it that way. Wherever you move the brake bias is going to affect the rate at which that you're adding the braking force is being used on certain tires. So if it's in the front, you're using your front tires more to brake the car. If you're using it in the rear, you're going to use the rear tires relatively more to brake the car. The tires that are being used to brake the car are going to have more heat, and you're also asking more of those tires when you perform the action. And as I said before, tires don't like to really do two things at once. I mean, they can, but they can't do them well, either one well. So if you're asking the front tires to do all the braking and start turning in, it's not going to want to do it. It's going to want to understeer. If you move some of that front tire work from braking to the rear tires, well, you've got a little bit more room to actually turn the car on the front end, and it's going to want to start to dive a little bit better. Overdo it, and all of a sudden you're asking your rear tires to brake and then also handle the forces of turning the car, and that's when you can start to spin if you overdo it and put the brake bias too far back, because the rear tires are going to lose grip first on entry, and that's where you tend to over-rotate and spin. Not to mention, if you lock a tire, if you lock the front tires, the car's just going to go straight and understeer. So it's much more controllable. If you lock a rear tire, the car is going to loop around, basically, because there's no grip in the rear. So if you're having trouble on entry, you feel like the car is just not rotating on trail braking, try moving the brake bias back, see what you think, and then go from there. All right, any questions about the Cup car before we move on to the actual Barber? Nope, hearing none? Okay, perfect. So we are going to...
Chris,
Oh, yes.
maybe you want to quickly talk about the locking up light on the dash.
Yes. So the dashboard of this car has lights to lock up. So these lights right here, if you can see my cursor, these little vertical lights that are on the right side and left side of the car, they correspond to the right side and the left side of the car's tires. So the right tires are the right lights, the left tires are the left lights. Those lights will light up a different color based on which tire is locking under braking. And I always get it wrong, so I'm going to throw it out there, and it's going to probably be the other side. But I want to say that if you see purple lights, you are locking a rear tire, and if you see yellow lights, you're locking a front tire. Can anybody confirm that?
It's the other way around.
The other way around. Okay, of course it is. Okay, so if you see yellow lights or amber lights blinking at you or solid on these little four lights here, then that means you have a rear tire locking. If you
Just
have,
go forward a bit, Chris. In the display, you should get some lockup.
oh, wait, right here. I don't.
Yeah.
I don't lock my tires though, so so you probably won't ever see lights. Let's see. Maybe into turn 5, I might have a little bit of a nibble. No, okay. So basically, when you see those lights, you're gonna get that means a tire is locking or right on the verge of locking. If it's amber, it's the rears. If it's purple, it's the fronts. It's a useful way to show that if you're constantly saying, let's say purple, and it means you're locking a front tire, move your traction or move your brake bias to the rear and let your rear tires help you out. So you're basically, when you're getting to that locking threshold, your front tires are the first thing to lock, which means if you move your brake bias to the rear a little bit, you're taking away that braking force from the front, moving it to the rear. So you could probably still brake at the same spot, but instead of the fronts locking, you're balancing it across all the tires. Ideally, what you want to do is you want to get to a situation where that if lockup happens, it's going to be the fronts right as the rear. Theoretically, you want all 4 to lock at the same time, and that's like maximum brake or braking effectiveness in the car. And if you're locking up the fronts or the rears by themselves first, theoretically, if you would have moved the bias in such a way where all 4 would have locked instead of just 2, you have more grip to be able to brake. The problem is that when we drive, not every corner is the same. Some are uphill, some are downhill, some are off camber, some are on camber, and that's going to affect which side of the car is going to brake. But if everything was like, if you put it all in a lab and it was a flat surface, braking, full emergency stop, how fast could I slow this car down? Theoretically, you would want the brake bias in a situation where all 4 are locking at the exact same time. So, but you can never get that in a racing conditions. So it's whatever's most comfortable, but your mileage may vary. Experiment. That's one of the nice things about the sim, is that if you make a mistake and something goes wrong, you can just get a new car and go back out. So try different things. Okay, let's get into the lap. So I just grabbed my fastest lap from the race in the prelude that we did, and we'll use this as kind of our guideline to go through. In terms of setups, what I'm using, what I'm not using, all I did was I went baseline setup, and I think I added two clicks to the rear wing, raised the rear a couple of tenths of an inch or something like that to offset the increased wing size, and then added 1 degree of toe in the front. That's it. So it's pretty darn close to baseline already. So for those of you driving challenge or sport, and you're wondering, well, I can't move it or I can't change anything, this is almost baseline. It's as close as probably doesn't make a difference. So baseline is decent, especially in this car, for learning it. The driving style and the driver of this car is going to make a much bigger difference than the actual setup. So, all right. And if anybody wants, I can put my setup in the classroom discussion. Feel free to use it. I don't like to hide anything. If you can beat me on my own setup, hey, more power to you. You're better than I am on my setup. So I'd rather that than me try to hide something. So everything's an open book with me. All right, coming into turn 1, let's at Barber, going down the straightaway. Turn 1 is one of my favorite corners on this particular track. We have some fantastic brake markers that we can see here. They're right in view, and we need to pick a spot that we can reliably hit under braking to slow the car down in such a way to make the corner. My spot is just before the 2 board, so maybe the 2.1 board for the braking, and it is a pretty decent initial brake pedal that bleeds off and trail brakes down into the corner. As I turn into the blind corner, my vision is going to be towards the apex, which is right at the curbing on the left as it touches the track, the very front little point. I'm trying to drive my left side tires right where those 2 connect. I don't want to take too much curbing because it can upset the balance of the car when it bounces up, but get as close as you can. And the idea is after you kind of do your initial turn into this car, you're off the brakes of the car, transition into throttle to stabilize the rear as you go through this very fast left-hander. I'm in 4th gear through here. You can take 3rd, but what I was finding was 3rd tends to start to overwhelm the rear tires because you have too much torque in the engine. You're going downhill. You don't need to be up in the rev range necessarily, and fourth gear allowed me to go to full throttle sooner and maintain it all the way through the corner. So let's see what it looks like. Coming into here, I'm going to brake right, boom. I went a little bit further, so right at the 2 board is where I'm braking. The brake pedal is going to go probably, like I said, a decent firm initial pedal and then immediately start bleeding off. So I go to about 50%. My turn-in point is about the 1, but frankly, I'm not looking at this board. My eyes are down here to try to see the curbing. As soon as I can kind of see that curbing or I anticipate seeing it, that's when I'm starting my turn-in. I turn in, I have a little bit of trail brake just on the initial turn-in to, as we said earlier, keep some weight on those front tires to allow them to grip, so there's less understeer. As we turn in and we transition, we're going down the hill. You'll notice you can see a lot of the track. If you can see a lot of the track, that means it's on camber, meaning the track is helping us like a bowl to go through the corner. If we can't see much of the track, then it's off camber and it's going to be, the gravity is going to be fighting against us and we're going to have less grip. So seeing a lot of track means on camber means you can go faster than you would normally expect if it was just a flat track. Coming downhill and then basically compressing right at or just after the apex point is also going to give us grip on the bottom right when we need it. So turn 1 tends to be understeer in the beginning, and then as we turn in and we're fighting through that understeer, as we go down the hill and we compress into the dip, that grip will come back to the car and the car will turn right at the apex. So as you can see here, I'm pretty much off all the pedals. I start transitioning to throttle just before the apex point. My eyes at this point are down the track to the track out point. In fourth gear, boom, pretty much full throttle if you can get it. On this particular lap, I had to do a little bit of a chicken lift because I went on too fast or I carried too much speed in, but you can still do that to manipulate it. Track out point is going to be over here on the right side. There's no reason to put your right side tires right on the grass if you didn't carry the speed to do that. Don't drive the car over to the grass. Let the car take you wherever it's going to go. If it ends up all the way over towards the right side on the grass, great. If it doesn't, you don't have to drive it over there because we're about to turn right through the beginning of the carousel. So I prefer having a little bit of gap between us and the grass for 2 reasons. 1, it helps set up the beginning into turn 2. And 2, it gives me a little bit of wiggle room if I go in or make a mistake. I can open my hands and still have a little bit of margin for error before I touch the grass and run off. So back it up and show what it looks like without me starting stopping. Brake at the 2 board, turn in, off the brakes, start transitioning to throttle, accelerate through, let the car go where it wants to go. Coming into turn 2, and the whole point of the carousel in general is we want to keep the car tight to the inside to minimize the distance traveled. The carousel is designed to make cars understeer. And then couple that with the fact that we're driving an understeery car. Sometimes it feels like you can never get this thing to turn in and stay in without stopping the car. But that's the way the carousel is. It's designed to eat tires and cause understeer. So we just don't want to, we want to minimize our time in the carousel. And the best way to do it is to stay as tight as we realistically can to minimize the distance traveled within the carousel. So that's the idea. I treat it like a double apex. So my first apex point is going to be right here where we can see this grass. And then the car will understeer out, but I don't want to go past, definitely not past mid-track, but I try to keep it in the first third of the track on the right side. We let the car kind of rotate through there, coast through a lot of the beginning through turn 2. And then once the front end of the car starts to tuck back in and start to come back into a second apex, it should be, or we're trying to time it to where the curbing is on the inside. If we do it right, we'll apex that curbing on the end of the corner. We'll accelerate as soon as we see that curbing and as soon as we know we're going to go down to that apex and keep that acceleration going all the way up the hill. So what it looks like is turning in somewhere before picking an apex point for your first apex. We have a little bit of brake, just a little bit to try to keep the front of the car engaged so it will turn. And then you can actually see with my pedals, I'm not touching the throttle, I'm just coasting, 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 coasting. And then right here, when the car starts to tuck in, halfway through the carousel and it's turn 3, my eyes are all the way around. So you can see this car that I'm following. My eyes are past it. I am looking for the curbing that we can just barely see coming up. And when I can see it, boom, there's the curbing. I know I'm going to apex it just after the beginning of the curbing, accelerating through here in 3rd gear, apex it in the normal spot, keep my hands nice and quiet, let the car open or let the car track where it wants to go and give it enough room so it can take the throttle and I'm not just scrubbing the fronts by holding them too hard. And if we do it right, we'll track out. The car will naturally track out all the way to the outside curbing here before our transition all the way up the hill. So if I back that up again and show you, we've gone through turn 1. A little bit of brake, downshift to 3rd gear, apex 1 here. And now I'm off all the pedals. I'm letting the turning scrub the speed. The car will start to tuck in. As soon as it starts to tuck in, I start picking up throttle in 3rd gear. Accelerate coming out of the corner. Let the car run all the way to the outside for the transition up the hill. All right, any questions through turn 1 through the carousel? Through turn 3? Okay, cool. You guys are good. All right, so coming up the hill, this blind uphill corner is slightly terrifying, especially in real life. I've driven Barber and raced Barber in real life before, and this uphill never gets old because it's it's a gut check to say the least. I'm gonna go to the cockpit so you can see what it looks like more cleanly. So as we're going up this hill, when we come out of the carousel, we should be all the way track left. When we're all the way track left, we are going to aim our car towards where this car is. So basically where we can see the apex of the next corner, that's our line that we're going to take up the hill. As we start to head up the hill and everything starts to kind of disappear, we're going to be looking immediately for the scoring pylon that will appear from behind the flag stand magically. As we crest this hill and basically apex this point right here, we're going to drive our car towards the flag stand. So we're going to open our hands as we go over the hill. The reason we do that is because if we have steering angle, the car is going to get light as soon as it crests the hill. And then when we come back and we land on the tabletop, the grip will come back. If we have steering angle in the car, what's going to happen is the car will stop steering. And then if we keep that steering angle, when we get to the top, all of a sudden it's going to grip up, and it's going to grip up at the front tires first because those are the first ones to go over the top. And when it grips up, you're going to steer the car to the right, and it can be violently, and there'll be no grip in the rear yet, and you will spin very easily. So make sure when you're transitioning up over the hill, you're pointed at the scoring pylon. You have a little bit of steering angle, but not a whole lot. And there's plenty of room over on the left on the driving out that you should be able to take it flat out, no problems whatsoever. Do not lift going over the crest of the hill. That's the worst thing you can possibly do. If you're going to lift because, hey, something doesn't look right, do it before you hit the crest. Don't do it as you crest the hill. Lifting while you crest the hill is going to really mess up with the balance of the car in a spot where you don't want to mess with the balance of the car, which is where it's really light. So commit, go over the hill. If you need to slow down for whatever reason, do it before you crest the hill. And you'll be okay. But you shouldn't have to lift. Stay with it.